Good afternoon. This is Paul Beck with the Oklahoma State University Ranchers Thursday Lunchtime Series. We've got an excellent session for you today. Let me introduce myself and I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves before we get started. I'm Paul Beck. I'm an extension beef cattle specialist at the Department of Animal and Food Sciences here in Stillwater. Dave?
David Lohlman, extension beef cattle specialist. Also, I focus more in the cow calf and stocker cattle area, but animal and food sciences as well. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rosalind Biggs. I am a veterinarian and also a beef cattle extension specialist housed within the College of Vet Med.
So thank you, and once again, welcome everybody to our August 21st session of the Ranchers Thursday Lunchtime Series. Today we've got Brian Pugh, a recent addition to our state livestock or our state agronomist or state specialist faculty, but a long-time extension specialist in our program, and he's going to cover the topic of adaptive versus continuous grazing management and talk about the advantages and antagonisms within those systems, piling on or adding to a lot of the discussion we've had in the previous weeks. So with that, Brian, glad to have you and looking forward to an excellent session.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Beck. Let me make sure I'm set up here where everyone can see. Is that the correct slide again, Dr. Beck?
You're good right there.
Okay. Well, as he said a few months ago when we started planning this, Dr. Lohlman called me and was asking, what kind of topics could we do related to grazing systems? And of course, adaptive grazing is a term that we're seeing everywhere. We're seeing in articles, it's on YouTube videos, and we thought it might be good to try to dive into at least the shallow end of the pool on adaptive grazing, explain what some of that means. And more accurately today, what I think I would like to do is try to provide some concepts for these different grazing systems that we currently have and how we can manage those grazing systems to full effect, both from an animal standpoint and from the plant or forage standpoint. So we're going to look at a little bit of the livestock side, but also mainly the plant science side of forage management for long-term healthy stands. Before we do, we have to get into a few definitions here, and I want to start out with one that is extremely important that we all should know, and that is carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is simply the unit of land required to run an animal unit. And there's a very important part there at the end of that sentence, without damaging the forage resource. And I think that's the part of the sentence that we all too often forget, is carrying capacity means that is going to be a system that is sustainable. We're not going to damage the forage, decrease forage productivity, increase undesirable forages because of our grazing management, because of the number of animals we have on a property. So carrying capacity is extremely important. And as you see here, I have an example, 7 acres per cow. That could be a legitimate carrying capacity in Oklahoma. Stocking rate. Now, this is a term that I see used actually incorrectly a lot in articles. The word rate implies there is a time component in this. Okay, so stocking rate is essentially the unit of land allotted per animal unit, all right, over a certain time. So typically we look at that in a year-long basis or a growing season basis. And a stocking rate might be 1 cow per 3 acres, all right? And maybe, depending on our forage system, say we have Bermuda grass or Old World Blue Stem, that's really only about 7 months of grazing potential there. So that is 1 cow per 3 acres for 7 months. We don't want to forget that we're also hauling in hay to feed those cows in the winter. So our true stocking rate is not a cow per 3 acres. It may be a cow per 5 or 6 acres, depending on where that hay came from. And also notice that I didn't say proper stocking rate. So again, 1 cow per 3 acres might be proper in a well-fertilized, introduced forage system. But if we're not fertilizing, it's probably not. So proper in front of stocking rate would imply that we base that stocking rate off of carrying capacity. And then the last term we're going to hit here on this slide is stocking density. And we've seen a lot greater use of this term in the last 10 years, 15 years, as we get into some of these very intensive rotational systems. Stocking density has been a buzzword, and that's simply just a snapshot in time, today, right now, or any time that we're turning cattle into a paddock, how much biomass of animals is on an acre of land. And I've learned to appreciate this value, this number. I think it tells us a lot about the hoof action, the treading effect on the soil surface. I think where it falls short is it really doesn't tell us about the density of animals on our forage resource. Again, that paddock could have 800 pounds of forage when we turn in, or it could have 4,800 pounds of forage when we turn in. And it doesn't represent that. So it's mainly on a unit area of land and represents that hoof action that's occurring on the soil. And I have 30,000 pounds per acre here, but some of these very intensive systems are much greater than that. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. Okay, so moving right in, I want to carry on. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I think it's important for us to put those definitions to effect here and use them. So let's start with like a continuous stock system. That's where we have one paddock or pasture that the cow spends the entire year in. That's a continuous stock system. And in this instance, I have 500 acres with 100,000 pound cows. That means my stocking rate is 5 acres per cow. My stocking density is 200 pounds per acre. Now that is a fairly low stocking density. We're not getting a lot of hoof action at one time on the soil surface. And again, as you see more of those numbers, that will start to make a little more sense to you. But let's move into a rotational system. And a rotational system would have 2 or more paddocks that we rotate cows between, and that allows some rest for the forage when we move to a separate paddock. In this example, I've used 500 acres, same 100 cows that weigh 1,000 pounds, but I've split that pasture up into 10 paddocks. What you'll notice, stocking rate is still 5 acres per cow. The stocking rate does not change based on these rotational systems. What did change is the stocking density at any one time. We see a tenfold increase in that to 2,000 pounds of livestock per acre. So again, I think that's an important concept. Stocking rate just tells us how much or the units of animal per unit of land over a set period of time. And again, that doesn't imply that it's accurate. And we'll get more into that here in a few minutes. So what about carrying capacity? We didn't address carrying capacity here on this page. I will show you a very simple way that you can go through some calculations to determine what your proper carrying capacity is. And that's paramount for any grazing system. We could go through the process of calculating animal unit months. Sometimes we do that, especially in range conditions. But for introduced pastures, there's a simpler way to do that. We have a fact sheet. Plant and Soil Science 2584 is on forage budgeting, and it's essentially looking at how much forage does my cow herd need for the year or for a 6-month period. You allot the time that you're interested in, and how much forage can I provide off this property. And by knowing those two things, we can make some really sound decisions on how much additional forage do I need, how much fertility needs to be applied to these pastures. And I won't spend a lot of time here because we have done this in the past in some of these presentations, but I do want to remind you today as we go through this that we don't get every pound of forage into a cow. So this 1,200 pound cow eating 2.5% of her body weight, she needs about 30 pounds of dry matter in her rumen every day. but we can't get every pound we grow. So we have to use this utilization factor. And the utilization factor is predicated or dictated by what type of grazing system we are using. And in this instance, I use 70%. That would be indicative of a fairly intensive rotational system. And what that means is that I have to put 43 pounds of dry matter in front of that cow's face every day to get 30 pounds of dry matter in her rumen due to forage losses. So we use that number, we move on down, and what we see is that cow is going to need about 16,000 pounds of forage for the entire year. That's 8 tons of forage per year. And yes, that number is accurate. And if we are not fertilizing introduced forages in Oklahoma, a World Blue Stem, Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, we are probably making about 1 ton per acre on average. So that means it takes about 8 acres of ground to run a cow. That would be proper carrying capacity, is 8 acres per cow. And I think a lot of us, if we honestly look, we can say we're probably exceeding the carrying capacity of our property currently. And that would be the first thing I would tell you moving forward from today is let's try to get back to a more conservatively stocked system, regardless of what type of grazing system it is. We simply move on down. We could say we want 100 animals, and we know we need 785 tons of forage to meet those animals' requirements. Then I need to figure out how much my property is producing. And again, if I have that 500 acres, I'm not fertilizing, I can assume, very rough rule of thumb, that I'm going to make about 500 tons. And I realize I'm extremely short of forage for that cow herd. That's how we get into some of these stocking systems where producers are feeding 120 plus days of hay, is we're simply exceeding the carrying capacity during the growing season. What can we do? We have some options here. If we're short, I can sell some cows, and now is a great time to do that. Sell off the bottom third of my herd potentially. That would make a huge difference in the forage supply that's in front of the remaining cows. I can buy inputs. I can go buy hay. I can grow more forage by using nitrogen. Introduced forages are highly responsive to nitrogen inputs. As a matter of fact, with just 50 pounds of actual N per acre on the entire 500 acres, I can double the production. I can go from 1 ton per acre to 2 tons per acre. Now I have 1,000 tons of supplied forage for that cow herd. So that's something we can do. And then also we can modify utilization. And that's really where these rotational systems come in, is we can improve the harvest of that forage that we've already grown. We've already expended the resources, the environmental resources to grow that forage. We might as well try to utilize as much of that as possible. So now let's move forward into selecting the proper grazing strategy. You notice I have that in parentheses because I'll be honest with you, I don't know that there is a proper grazing strategy. I've worked with hundreds of producers and I've never found 2 that had the exact same grazing system with the exact same results. So grazing systems are really best tailored to your own property. You might look at this picture here, and I would caution you to look at snapshots in time when you're driving down the road and you see your neighbor's pasture and you say, well, that's overgrazed. I could very easily tell you that this picture was taken, the cows had been turned in the morning before. That was about 10-inch tall Bermuda, and we're standing at the gate getting ready to move those cows to the next paddock. Again, that would be a workable rotational system. The truth is, in this picture, that's actually into June, continuously stocked pasture. We're right at the tail end of the spring flush, and we have no additional forage standing in front of that cow herd. So this would be a prime example of exceeding the carrying capacity of the land. That's the last thing we want to do. What I try to tell producers is any system that does not exceed the carrying capacity is proper. It doesn't matter what type of system, what type of rotational system you have, or maybe it's a continuous system. As long as you don't exceed the carrying capacity, I think you're in the right. I think you're on the plus side. How many types of different grazing systems, or stocking systems more accurately, are there? If we really want to simplify this, we can say there's 2. Okay, the first is our traditional continuously stocked pasture. One big pasture, cow spends the entire year in there, the stocker calf, whatever it might be. And the other form of stocking system is a form of limited access. And if we start to break that apart, that's when it gets a little more complicated. We have basic rotational systems. Some people call them slow rotational systems, intensive rotational systems that might have 8 to 16 paddocks. I feel like anytime we start to get into daily fence movements, we're starting to move into the area of mob or MIG type systems. So that takes a lot more labor to move that fence on a daily basis for those cows. We have strip grazing systems, deferred grazing, stockpile grazing. Forward grazing is essentially where we might take a class of animals with a higher nutrient requirement, like replacement heifers, and actually run them in front of maybe a cow herd, a group of dry cows that have a lower nutrient requirement. We allow the forward grazers, the replacement heifers, to harvest the top third of the forage. That's the highest quality part of that forage. And we move the cows in behind them to, in essence, clean up what's left behind. And that would be a little lower quality, but hopefully enough to meet that class of animals' requirements. And then we also have creep grazing systems. And again, there's many more here that I don't have, but that's kind of the basics, or hits the high points of the different systems. And then we bring in this new term, this adaptive grazing. And I getting a lot of questions on it. I'm seeing it everywhere. And the question is adaptive grazing a system or is it a concept? And I think I hopefully will give you a little bit of information on that as we get to the end of this presentation. But I think we have to walk before we can run. So let's walk through some basic slides here on managing those grazing systems. Why do we want to rotationally graze at all? What are the advantages? And one of the biggest advantages we see is just that improvement in forage utilization. By restricting access to the entire pasture into a smaller paddock, we can make cows more uniformly graze those pastures and harvest that forage that we've already grown. And we do lose quite a lot of forage in grazing systems. And it is true, we lose some to insects, some to trampling by the cow. We lose quite a lot from manure pats and urine spots, and animals refuse to graze that area. But one of the biggest reasons that we lose forage in continuous grazing systems or slow rotation systems is because of forage maturity. That plant simply gets too mature, quality drops well below what that animal needs, and the animal refuses to eat that forage. And we've all seen this. We've seen areas that cows just keep coming back to the same spot. They're grazing grass that's 2 inches high rather than grass that's boot top deep right beside it. And that's because they're keying in and they're selecting that higher quality forage. So that's a beauty of a rotational system, is we can control that selectivity of the animal better in a rotational system. There's been a lot of trials done on rotational systems and introduced forages across Midwest and Southeast United States, and we do see advantages in those systems. Typically, we can increase, in this case here, we increase the stocking rate 36%. We saw similar weaning weights on calves, although oftentimes we'll see slight reduction in performance on rotational systems. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. But when we look at the ability to run more cows on the same acreage, it essentially gives us more opportunity for adding gain per acre. So in this case, we had 90 additional pounds of gain per acre with the same weaning weight of those calves. Now, another interesting thing that we see in a lot of these rotational systems is that some introduced forages, Bermuda is an example of that, can produce more forage through the growing season if grazed properly than if not grazed. Okay, so if they're not grazed, that mature forage forms a canopy, very dense canopy, and it prevents younger, newer growth from starting in the forage stand. But if we will graze that off, we can keep that plant in a vegetative growth stage all the way through the summer. And that is alluding to what you're seeing down here at the bottom, we actually had about 700 pounds less hay required for the rotational graze cows than the continuous. And the reason that we see that again is because of that improved forage utilization allows us to carry farther into the fall before we have to start feeding hay. So the same amount of forage will last us longer with the same amount of cows, or slightly elevated forage production levels can take us even further into the fall. So there are some real advantages there for rotational systems. Multiple states have done these trials and shown at least 25 to 30% increase in stocking rate is very feasible, if not higher than that. So now we're getting into starting to select or pick a grazing system. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what's the ultimate goal of a forage system? And for me, I would say from an animal standpoint, the very most important thing that we could do with a grazing system is try to meet all nutrient requirements of that animal. And we do that with the today concept. And that's a concept, I guess, I kind of picked up from my father back through the years. But you look at that animal today. What is her stage of production today? What's her body condition score today? And we try to make sure the forage we supply her, whether by species or by maturity, is of good enough quality to meet her requirements today. And if we can do that and then apply that concept for the next 364 days, we have a really nice grazing system where the cow does most of the work. She's harvesting a lot of that forage. So that's the number one thing with a grazing system. Meet the animal's requirements as much as possible. That limits the amount of hay and supplement that we need to bring in for those animals. And that's the livestock management side of these systems. The other thing that we need to really focus on is supplying recovery periods to promote healthy forage stands. So that forage needs some form of rest, especially those, and we're going to use this term, ice cream plants. Those are plants that animals selectively graze as soon as they're put into a paddock. That's very palatable plants like Johnson grass or like crabgrass. Those are good indicator species. You won't see those in continuously stocked pastures. But we have to have those recovery periods, and that's dependent on the species of forage at hand, environmental conditions that we're having, and the level of previous defoliation. So if we took every leaf off that plant, it's going to require a longer rest period than if we only remove the top half of that plant. That's the pasture management aspect of a grazing system that we'll dive a little deeper into. And then ultimately, we want to do these things in perpetuity. And that means this is the sustainability portion of that. And I know to keep the politics out of that word, it is a good word. There is nothing wrong with being sustainable in a grazing system. Why would we not want to put all this sweat equity into building a good grazing system for ideal livestock performance, also for ideal forage stand health, and then not want it to persist in the future? That is the idea of sustainability. It needs to be a system that props itself up, that supports itself and continues down the road. Okay, so let's take a couple slides here and let's look at livestock requirements from the livestock side of the equation on a forage system. And again, Dr. Beck and Dr. Lallman, they're far more advanced than I am in this regard, but I think it's important for us to understand grazing systems are unique in that we're dealing not with an agronomy system, not with a livestock system, but with the interface of two systems. So it really takes a knowledge in both areas to be an effective grazer. If we start off with a dry cow, what we know is she needs about 8% protein and 53 TDN. More accurately, she needs a set amount of protein, a weight of protein and energy in her diet each day, as you can see there. And if we have lactating cows, we know those lactating cows have higher requirements. She's going to need about 10% crude protein and 59% TDN. Those percentages only work if we're allowing that cow to fill her rumen to capacity for the day. If we're limiting that cow on the amount of forage she can consume in our grazing system, And I want you to think here about that picture I showed you where we've exceeded carrying capacity. If we're limiting the amount of forage she consumes, then the quality of that forage has to be much higher than this to meet the actual protein and energy requirement of that cow for the day. All right, so that's where we get into some of these nuances with managing these grazing systems. We need to keep forage in front of that cow or that grazing animal every day. Other things besides stage of production, the size of that animal that influence dry matter intake, here's the big one, and that goes back to the agronomy side of the equation, is forage quality. Forage quality is one of the biggest determining factors of how much an animal will actually eat in a forage system. The higher the forage quality, the more they will eat. The lower the forage quality, the less they will eat. I'll show you that in just a second. But this is a vital concept to understand. And I spend quite a bit of time in our cropping systems class with plant and soil science students and in our senior vet med class in the forage portion, teaching them about this concept because I think it's the most important thing we can learn to manage a grazing system. We also can change dry matter intake by supplementing those cows. We know that we can add a small amount of protein on average quality forages and increase the amount of forage consumed on a daily basis. And then we get into these down here at the bottom. We get into grazing behaviors of the animal, morphology of the plant. That's basically what the plant looks like as a cow's mouth comes up to it. You know, if we have 12-inch tall Bermuda grass and we turn cows into that, they can take big bites of that Bermuda grass. They can fill their rumen very rapidly, and then they can go to shade and lay down and ruminate. And that's a very efficient system. If my Bermuda grass is only an inch tall, that cow is going to stand out there and work herself to try to fill that rumen, and she may not ever be able to do that if there's not enough forage quantity. A cow will only take so many bites in a day. So again, there's lots of different factors that goes into how efficiently we can get that forage in a cow. It's something you need to maybe research down the road and think about as you're developing this forage system. Here's a graph. I know it's a little bit busy, but I like to show this because I think this, for me, is the most interesting thing of a ruminant animal grazing a forage and how forage quality dictates so much of what we see in animal performance. And this would be directly linked to those grazers across the state that I would say are very successful with their grazing system, is they understand this concept. So basically down here on the x-axis, we have forage height, or forage biomass would be another way to look at it, is increasing as we go to the right. That plant is in its highest quality state when it's extremely young or immediately after a grazing event as it tries to regrow. And as that plant matures, quality drops, protein drops, energy drops, and digestibility drops as well. So the interesting thing is we think that we're going to have a projected level of intake by a cow. But what we see is as that forage quality starts to drop, we actually get a reduced intake by the cow. And let me see if I can explain why that is the way I do for the students in class. If we look at very high protein and energy forages, okay, let's say like wheat pasture, that usually results in excess nutrient supply to the animal if we let her graze unrestricted, if we let her fill her rumen. And the reason is that cow is consuming more protein and energy per pound of forage. It's higher quality forage, so she's getting more right off the bat. She's also going to be able to utilize more of that protein and energy because it's more digestible. It's in a more digestible form. And because that forage is more digestible, we have this concept called rate of passage. And rate of passage is how quickly we evacuate that forage out of the rumen into the rest of the digestive tract. When we move it out of the rumen, the cow now feels hungry again. She gets up and goes back and eats some more. So if we look at a 24-hour period, what we see is that highly digestible forages increase intake. So we might project 25 pounds of forage consumption. and she might actually consume 29 pounds of forage because the rate of passage is so high. The exact opposite is true for low quality forages. Not only is she consuming less protein and energy per pound of forage, but she can digest less of it because digestibility has dropped. And because digestibility has dropped, our rate of passage is very slow. So we don't evacuate that rumen very quickly and intake goes down. So instead of 25 pounds, if she's eating wheat straw, maybe we're looking at 18 or 19 pounds of intake. So this is the real catch-22 of forages in a grazing system, is you have to understand forage maturity directly relates to animal performance. And that is the easiest thing that we can manage just by making sure our forages don't get too mature. One other thing I want to point out on the animal side is that cows or any other grazing livestock is a selection tool. They will tend to select away from desirable forages. Okay, and a prime example of that again is Johnson grass or crabgrass. If we allow those animals enough access to those forages, they will, for all practical purposes, graze them to death. They will continue to remove leaves. That's the plant's solar panels that it uses to build carbohydrates. If we don't have that opportunity, that plant will eventually die. That root system will shrink back and die. So this is normally correlated to paddock or pasture stocking rate. It's a function of intensity, how many animals are in there, and the amount of time that those animals are in there. Short bouts on these ice cream forages, we don't tend to see drastic reductions in those plant populations over time. If we allow those cows to have too much time in there, we will start to see shifts in the species in these pastures. So again, cows are a selection tool. To summarize that, livestock grazing objectives: number one, meet nutrient requirements of the animal, control that forage maturity, and we do that with the animals themselves. Increase beef production per unit area. Doesn't matter what type of grazing system we have, if it's continuous, if it's intensive rotational, we all need to try to improve beef production per unit area. Improve forage utilization in your system, improve manure distribution in that system, prevent overgrazing of those ice cream plants if possible. Monitor your livestock performance. That's going to be key, and it's going to be even more key as we get into the adaptive grazing here in just a little bit. And then maybe we have some riparian, soil protection, wildlife type options. Maybe we want to manage based on certain species of wildlife. Those can all be worked into these grazing systems. Now let's look at forage requirements. One of the most important things that you can take with you from a plant standpoint, from the agronomy side of a forage system, is that the roots tend to mirror the shoots. And what does that mean? It means what we see in biomass above ground over time, on average, is what we will see for root mass below ground. This is an example of some fescue plants here. The one on the right has been defoliated very short repeatedly, and you see that root system has retracted to about the same mass. Now, the question I would ask you is, if you have pastures that look like that, and we look at that root system, how much soil exploration do we think is occurring there for nutrient uptake, for water resources, especially if we start to get into a drought? Droughty soils tend to dry out from the top down, and that just happens to be where all the roots are on that plant. So that's a very drought-prone plant, That's not a way to build a resilient forage system. This plant on the left would be. And we do see, as we extremely defoliate plants, we actually slow down the recovery of that plant fairly significantly. So again, if we remove 80 to 90% of leaf, then we see about 100% of that root growth is stopped in the short term. Again, that plant is totally having to re-gear, send carbohydrates back to the above ground portion to start to regrow new solar panels. So try not to graze that tight on your forage stands. Here's a good, helpful checklist for your different forage types. Again, our prostrate forages like Bermuda grass and white clover, we can graze them a little tighter, down to about 2 inches. Our intermediate types, Old World Bluestem, fescue, small grains, annual ryegrass, we really need to leave about 4 inches of residue on them when we pull off. And then we have very upright species such as Johnson grass, such as our native grasses like Eastern Gamma or Big Blue. All of those plants have a very high growing point. So we need to be pulling cows off of those at 8 to 12 inches minimum residue. And this goes for rotary mowers and swathers as well. If we're scalping that field, that plant will have to use carbohydrates from below ground to regrow its above ground portion. And that just makes that plant weaker. Good rule of thumb is leave 2 leaves. I always tell people leave at least 1, but if we leave 2 leaves on the plant, that plant can immediately start to photosynthesize and regrow after a grazing event. Another busy slide, but a very important concept. I alluded to it briefly earlier in the livestock portion. Again, we're down here at this 2-leaf stage. This green area is the yield of our forage stand. And essentially those 2 little solar panels, 2 leaves start to capture sunlight. And before you know it, we have 4 leaves, and then we have 8 leaves, and then we have 16 leaves. It's this sigmoidal or exponential growth of that plant. And that's an exaggeration on the number of leaves, but it gives you the idea that it takes leaves to make new leaves. Okay, keep that in mind. But you also see the decline in protein and energy, and also palatability. And that's how much an animal wants to eat that plant. That keys into that selectivity of the animal. So that tends to decline too as we get into these mature forage stages. And then we see lignin increased. And the easy way to remember lignin, that's what holds trees up. That's what holds these high yielding forage varieties up. When we put more stem on and more weight of leaves on that stem, we have to have more lignin to hold it up. But lignin is indigestible. So as that plant gets more mature, we're going to see increasing lignin contents. That decreases digestibility of the forage. So if you keep this little graph in mind as you're managing your forages from a plant and animal standpoint, I think you'll be well ahead. Again, for introduced forages like Bermuda grass, maybe crabgrass, hay grazers, things like that. Normally, we're going to see really good quality around that 4-week stage. Anytime we get past about 6 weeks of age, that's where we're starting to transition into reproductive growth. We will see protein and energy start to decline fairly rapidly. And here's an example of that in Bermuda grass. 2 weeks of regrowth, 16% protein, 56 TDN. That's a very good quality Bermuda grass sample. But you'll notice by 6 weeks of regrowth, we're barely meeting a dry cow's requirement. By 8 weeks of regrowth, we fell below her requirements. That means that either we're going to have to supplement her or she's losing weight on that forage quality. So age of the forage is one of the most important things you can manage. Agronomic system objectives here: improve plant vigor. That helps with those carbohydrate reserves in the root, helps keep them at elevated levels. Control forage maturity, preserve critical residue, leave 2 leaves. Improve the grazing distribution across those paddocks. Avoid overgrazing. We didn't mention this, but most introduced forages are going to try to regrow about 3 to 5 days after a grazing event. So after they've been bit off, 3 to 5 days later, we're going to see regrowth start to occur. Guess what a cow will do if she's standing there 5 days later and that young, new, lush growth starts popping back out? She will bite it again. So what we want to do is try to prevent those animals from rebiting that plant until we've had a sufficient rest period. That is extremely hard on plants. Consider your nutrient cycling and soil characteristics from an agronomy standpoint. Minimize bare ground. That is super important. Bare ground is a great way to lose soil moisture. It's a great way to see potential erosion issues, but it's also a great way to see less desirable, unpalatable grasses or forbs start to move into our grazing system. So try to minimize bare ground. Integrate cool season, warm season in legumes, and monitor forage supply as well as, again, maybe riparian protection, wildlife considerations, things like that. Okay, let's move into a few of our systems now, and let's look at a few pros and cons, and then let's talk about our adaptive grazing, and then we'll take some questions here. So starting with continuous stocking, that is our conventional system. It's been around a long time. Again, that's where an animal has unlimited access to a pasture for the entire year. Here is one thing that I want you to carry home with you. Typically, we see best individual animal performance in continuous systems. So if you have old Bessie, she's a prize winner. You want her to be in great shape all the way through the year. Probably the easiest way to do that is a properly stocked continuous system. Okay. And that's because she can be super selective on what species of plant she eats today and what portion of that plant she eats today. So her nutrient intake will be extremely high. Problem with continuous stocking, there's no allowance for deferment. There's no allowance for stockpiling other than just allowing excess mature forage that the cows are already refusing to continue to stockpile for later use. The only true way to alter these systems is with stocking rate. So that would be maybe decreasing stocking rate, maybe increasing. Rarely do we see that we need to increase stocking rate on continuously stocked pastures. Another issue with these is that it could increase your cow cost. So what we see if we're talking a herbicide application or a fertilizer application, and I'm stocked at maybe a cow per 3 or 4 versus one of these continuous stock systems where I'm a cow per 8 or 10, I just added more cost on top of that cow's head to run through there with a herbicide application. So that's a downfall. It does tend to be safer on average. Now, this is a statement that might back me in a corner a little bit, but on average, continuously stocked systems are safer than rotational systems because errors in stocking rate are pretty obvious early on. You know, rotational systems, we can get into a bind because it looks like we have forage in front of the cow herd, when in reality, we may be well above carrying capacity. So again, that is one thing I always think about with continuous stocking. It's a little bit easier to see based on where we're at in the year, how much forage is in front of the cow herd and how safe are we with that carrying capacity and our stocking rate. Remember, continuous stocking will eliminate those ice cream forages over time. And the reason is those cows are not restricted. They're not prevented from going back and rebiting those plants 5, 6, 7 days later, and again 5, 6, or 7 more days later, and that is very hard on the energy reserves in that plant. One thing I put down here, I won't say always, but the thing you have to be careful of with continuous stocking, it's great from an animal standpoint in most cases, but we can lose sight of those agronomic goals. So those plant management parameters, sometimes we miss the mark with a continuous system because we can't rest that forage. This is an example here. This is a continuously stocked pasture. If you're a purebred operator, maybe you're trying to raise really high quality individual animals, continuous stock systems are actually still really nice because that animal can be so selective. We can get really big weaning weights off calves compared to some of these intensive rotational systems. Again, here's a cow per 6.5 acres, annual Lespedeza Bermuda, and some ragweed. You will not find crabgrass or Johnson grass in those pastures because, again, those are the ice cream forages and the cows consume those to the point that they don't exist in that system anymore. A few pitfalls to watch for with continuous grazing. We do see selective overgrazing of those ice cream forages because we have no rest capability for those very desirable plants. And like we said, animals are a selection tool. Less desirable plants, on the other hand, are typically avoided. They're over-rested. That can be a problem too because then they can proliferate in our grazing system. We do a lot of times see shifts in species composition, especially if you're looking at something like in the picture here, where we've got really short overgrazed areas. where we're starting to open up bare ground. Okay, that is a prime opportunity for invasives such as broom sedge or other forbs to invade that pasture. So those are some things to think about. Rotational stocking, the advantage really lies in utilization efficiency, improving the amount of forage that we've grown that we can actually get into that grazing animal, or insensitive species management. So that might be management of a crabgrass pasture, management of a lagoon pasture. Rotational stocking systems can give us those opportunities. We do tend to see reduced individual animal performance. This is important because, and I don't like to use this word, but there's some truth to it. We are forcing that animal to eat more of the lower digestible parts of the plant and more and less digestible species of forages as well. So that's one important thing to remember. And the more intensive our rotational system is, the less selective that animal can be, and typically the lower the nutrient quality of that diet that animal gets on a daily basis. We do get much increased utilization of grown forage, increased gain per unit area. There's lots of opportunities depending on the system for rest, deferment of forage for either plant parameters, such as just simply, I need to rest that, I've overgrazed it too hard the last 2 years, or even for soil parameters. Maybe we need to rest that soil because of compaction. We also have opportunities for stockpiling. We get much more uniform use of forage, but there is more risk to overall stand health because we can be well above carrying capacity and not realize it right off the bat. I hear this from a lot of producers that have converted to rotational system. Their animals are often more acclimated to humans because we're out there moving them from one pasture to the next, and they realize, hey, this person is going to turn me into some new high quality lush forage. They tend to respond a little better. Rotational systems help protect ice cream plants and legumes, provide rotational hay opportunities. So maybe 2 or 3 paddocks ahead of the cow herd, we see that the forage is really growing too fast and it's going to be too mature by the time we can get the cow herd to it. That gives us an opportunity to mow some hay for use in the wintertime. And it's good to rotate those areas we're harvesting hay because of the nutrient removal that we see in hay fields. Again, these systems, if they're implemented properly, tend to balance livestock and agronomic goals. Pitfalls, they can mislead us into exceeding carrying capacity, require additional labor and resources over continuous. We may have a lot more fencing that goes into that, water issues. We've got to supply water to all those paddocks. And then we're obviously going to have more labor just moving the cattle. Again, if you're a purebred operator, old Bessie might suffer a little bit at the expense of her neighbors. Now, we may make more gain per acre, but again, Bessie herself might do a little worse than a continuous stock system. And improper long rotations result in low forage quality. That's the #1 error I see working with producers over the last 20 years. They go from a continuous to a rotational system, and they make an error in that they rotate those cows too slow. They're too concerned with grazing all the forage in this paddock before we go to the next paddock. And I'm going to give you a quick example of that. This was our research station at Valiant in McCurtain County, 945 grazable acres, 270 cows. What they were doing was basically taking the cows at spring green up. We'd move them into these paddocks down here. We would let the cow eat that all the way down to that critical residue height, move them to the next paddock. By the time we ever got back to these paddocks, we were already in mid to late July, early August. By the time we got back here and grazed that, we were in September. Based on what the concepts we've talked about today, I hope what you're hearing is that forage was way too mature for those cows. And because of that, what we saw for a couple of years there, at the weaning date around the 1st of October, cow weights was routinely 1,100 to 1,150 pounds. Body condition scores were about 4.5. That gave us some issues with conception rates during the breeding season earlier in the summer. But what we did is essentially just change the way we rotate. Instead of letting the cows eat all the forage before we move, I told the station superintendent, let's make sure we're moving these cows to where we get around the entire property in 30 to 40 days. And we're going to do that all summer long until forage growth slows down, and then we're going to slow the cows down. And what we saw is that we essentially had an increase in cow body weight all the way through the summer. And we ended up at 1,245 pounds, which was about 1.5 body condition scores higher than what they'd been the previous 2 years. And we've been able to maintain those better body conditions in those cows simply because we're capturing nutrients as they're available during that spring flush. All right, so good rule of thumb, when the forage grows fast, the cow herd needs to go fast so we can harvest that high nutrient concentration in that forage. Last here, before we get into adaptive, is mob stocking. I think we've heard a little bit about that. This was really the craze 15 years ago. A lot of producers did this and did this with great success too. But again, we've had some issues with producers that had some failures with mob stocking. So again, the devil's always in the details in how we implement these systems. The real advantage of mob is in utilization efficiency. They're always extremely high. We also get consumption of undesirables. I put broom sedge here because it is a species that doesn't tolerate a lot of grazing pressure. And a mob system is an easy way to put grazing pressure on broom sedge and see a drastic reduction in broom sedge populations. And then we can also get long forage rest cycles. So that's good to a point. We need rest for that forage. We just need to make sure that our mob system is not too long of rest to where we're coming back on extremely old, low quality, low digestibility forage. We get sometimes much reduced individual animal performance, but where we're trying to make up for it is the ability to really have extremely high stocking rates. So much more gain on a per acre basis. If implemented incorrectly, though, there are times where we have less gain per acre than just an intensive rotational system. And again, these mob systems require a lot of labor. Very uniform use of forage. We can say that, no doubt, about mob systems. We will essentially look like you can go in there, mow that with a lawnmower. They will consume almost everything. It will provide additional rotational hay opportunities. One of the issues I will say is that some of these systems, if we're not careful, we start to lose sight of livestock goals. So we start to fall below animal requirements with what they need, and we see animal performance declines. So this is kind of going to the far end of the spectrum, maybe getting a little farther away from the livestock aspect and a little more focused on just extreme rest for our forage. Some of the pitfalls, forage maturity can be a real problem depending on how we rotate through that mob system. Does require very high labor input, difficult to time cattle movement at critical stubble height, critical residue height. You know, I might roll out there and see those cows are at 3 to 4 inches. And if I come back in 2 hours, all of a sudden there's nothing left. And I've grazed below that leave to leaf theory. So again, that's going to be a hard part of mob grazing. Does require significant cash outlay and resources, fence, water, mineral feeders, shade. Those are all things that have to be considered on these very small paddock, very intensive, quick movement type systems. Here's another one that I've actually ran into a couple of times with some producers that were implementing mob or strip type grazing, poisonous plant consumption. We can actually force an animal to consume poisonous plants. And now usually in a mob system, we divide that poison out, that poisonous compound, amongst multiple animals, but that's not always the case. So we have to be very careful there. And then last, and we're seeing more research into this, is animal stress. You know, those animals in those mob systems, they're fighting with their neighbors right next to them. At some point down the road, they're realizing that they're not getting to be as selective as they would like to be in what they graze, and that stresses those animals some. Again, they're eating undesirable plants. So these are things that we need to keep in mind too, if this is the system that we're interested in. Last thing I'll show you here on that mob grazing, if we'll look at going from 1 to 2 paddocks, we go from 0% plant rest to 50% plant rest. Half the time that plant's being rested. That's a huge change. If we go to a 16 paddock rotation system, 94% of the time that plant is being rested. It's not being grazed. That's awesome. That's great. But if we go to a 32 paddock system, we have 97% rest. Now, what I would tell you from the agronomic side of a forage system or a grazing system, the plant doesn't know the difference between 3% change in rest, but you will know the difference between a 16 and a 32 paddock system because you've basically just doubled your labor and you've had a lot more cash outlay for resources. So again, there is going to be an optimum. And what we see, it's no different than any other trait we look at. Gain per animal decreases as we increase stocking rate. Gain per acre increases to a certain point as we increase stocking rate. But just like everything else, the producer with the highest gain per animal or the producer with the highest gain per acre, they're not the ones that are actually making the highest net returns. That tends to be somewhere in the middle. So that optimum is going to be somewhere in the middle there. All right, Dave, I promise I'm getting right down here to the end. Now we're going to talk about adaptive grazing. This is some things that I had found just researching what some of these adaptive grazing principles are, very goal-oriented. They encourage or promote plant diversity and plant health. That's great. That's a good thing. Soil health parameters, again, the jury's kind of out on that. How much changes in soil health are we actually making with some of these concepts or some of these grazing systems? Proper stocking rate and high stocking density. I can definitely get behind the proper stocking rate theory there. Frequent movement and frequent rest. Again, I think there's advantages from the plant side there with that rest. Management and flexibility are emphasized in this system. So I want to key you in on that word right here, flexibility. That's probably what I like most about the concept of adaptive grazing. Need to be willing to adapt your stocking rate. That means changing the number of animals out there, the dwell time in individual paddocks, where your fences are. That fence might change 3 times this year, and where your water sources are. So you have to be really flexible, really adaptable in pretty much all parameters of that grazing system. And typically these systems are highly reliant on temporary fencing technology. So where I'm at on adaptive grazing, I don't have anything against it. I think there's a lot of aspects like we just talked about that are really good. What I will tell you though is it's not a stocking method. It is a grazing concept. Okay, it's not a way we stock. It's not like a 4 paddock rotation system. You have 4 paddocks, you leave the cows in there. It's a concept to observe things occurring in your grazing system and then try to change those for the better. So we want to observe our animals, observe our forages, and make changes for improved animal performance, for improved forage production, for improved environmental conditions. Maybe that's soil, maybe that's riparian areas. It is not a formula. It's not something that someone can write on a piece of paper and give to you. It is really a learning process based on your observations of your own grazing system and how you can make them better. And that's going to be the hardest part about implementing adaptive grazing, is it's going to take some knowledge to be able to do that. And hopefully I've given you a little bit of that knowledge today from a livestock standpoint and from a plant standpoint. Now, I would argue if you've grazed cows for more than a year or 2, you have probably implemented adaptive grazing at some point. If you ever made changes on the fly related to your stocking rate because of drought, rest periods of the forage, paddock size, maybe where your water or mineral distribution points are to try to move cows to a different part of a paddock, plant recovery speed based on environmental conditions, or even haying excess forage in front of the cows. Those are all adaptive grazing concepts. We're adapting to changes that are occurring on the fly. The beauty of these systems, the thing I do really like about adaptive grazing, it doesn't back you in a corner to say, well, I'm in a 4-paddock system. I move the cows every 7 days, period. No, maybe 4 paddocks not the best. Maybe we need a 6. Maybe we don't need to move 7 days. Maybe we don't need to worry about time at all. We base it on forage availability and forage growth, forage maturity and forage quality. That is the way to be an adaptive grazer. Again, some examples: mob stocking to consume ragweed, cerisa, blackberry, maybe for just a day or two. Maybe you pull a hot wire across a corner where you've got blackberry and, hey, we're going to let the cows defoliate that blackberry. We would probably see a reduction or at least an increase in grass growing underneath some of those tall statured plants. Maybe we're getting Johnson grass growing in a paddock in our rotational system. Happens all the time. And we decide we're going to stock our bull battery or our replacement heifers in there this year in a continuous stocked format. That would allow those animals to have unrestricted access to that Johnson grass and continue to graze it below the growing point and potentially kill that Johnson grass out of our system. Grow fast, go fast. Changing or splitting a paddock because of underutilization. Haying ahead of the cow herd, forward grazing calves, skipping a paddock with severe compaction. Or here's another one. I see a lot of people do this. I'm not going to graze that paddock right now because my soil is too wet and I'm going to get a lot of pugging out there. That's going to hurt the crowns of those forage plants. That's adaptive grazing. That's responding to what Mother Nature and what man-made changes are causing in our grazing system. So again, when I look at this adaptive grazing, it's a great concept. I love it. It is not a new grazing system. It can be applied to any of those other grazing systems. It does not itself by name cure soil, water, or forage systems. That is down to us to make sure we're not exceeding carrying capacity and we're setting up a forage system that's best suited to maximize to optimize animal performance while also optimizing the health of our forage stand. Here's probably the biggest thing that I could come up with to put down. Adaptive grazing is only going to be as good as the forage and livestock knowledge held by you, the grazer. The more you know about plant physiology, plant growth, what makes a plant happy, and the more you know about ruminant nutrition and what makes an animal happy and what makes performance increase, the better you're going to be with an adaptive grazing system. It's about responding to those natural and man-made changes in the short term to maintain long-term resiliency. And we could just as easily call it responsive grazing. Okay. And then I'm pretty much wrapping it up here, but I do get questions a lot of times. What would be your recommendations for if we're starting a rotational system, if we're improving a rotational system? And we've covered all these here today. But these are the things that you need to remember. Leave 2 leaves on the plant. Provide rest based on the species, 2 to 4 weeks. Aim for a full rotation within 4 to 6 weeks to keep forage maturity low. Design your paddock size to be in and be out within about 3 to 5 days. And that's not a necessity, but ultimately down the road, maybe your system would get you there. Use your cow body condition score and targeted weight gain of calves to determine how much leaf versus how much stem we're going to force, again, those animals to remove. When it grows fast, go fast. When it grows slow, go slow. Avoid bare ground and be a responsive grazer. Again, I hope that was worth something today. I know that was a little bit long. I went right at 1 hour, so I apologize for that, but this is a very in-depth discussion. We could spend a lot more time than that diving deeper into it, but if we have questions, I'll be glad to take those. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Once again, as always, feel free to put any questions you have either in the chat or the Q&A sections at the bottom of your Zoom screen. One question, you had the slide showing the recommended grazing heights for forages. What would that be for, a tall grass prairie versus like in western Oklahoma, a shorter grass type prairie system?
Okay. So on the short grass plants, especially short grass plants, now those are going to be down here again, 2 to 3 inches on something like buffalo grass. If we're talking short grasses in some of our grandmas merging into mid grass, then we're going to be minimum of 4 to 6 inches on those. That would be ideal. And then as we get into those tall grass species, again, much like Johnson grass, those have very high growing points, and we would rather see producers stay in that 8 to 12, no shorter than 8 to 12 inches. And again, it just simply comes back to those solar panels. If we're removing all of those solar panels, we start asking that plant to use energy reserves from the root to regrow those leaves. And if we do that enough and frequently enough, we'll start to lose those plants from the system.
Some of the discussions we've had where, you hear adaptive grazing management discussed, they talk about grazing to a homozygous or a uniform grazing height, where with a lot of our natives, we really need that heterozygosity as far as where plants are. It's, the strength of that is in the differences in a lot of those mixtures. So that's really good stuff. Thank you.
Dr. Beck,
Yes, sir.
I just have an observation. Maybe this will get stimulate a little bit of conversation in the chat. But Brian, I like your drawing the relationship of animal performance with basically grazing intensification, which maybe to simplify it, I'll just say more paddocks generally, and the need to rotate through those paddocks to harvest forage before it gets more mature leads to lower animal performance. So then the response to that, both from a conceptual standpoint and from what I think I see in on ranches when people move to a more intensive grazing system over time, is animals they gradually move to select for, or maybe just go out and purchase animals that have lower requirements, lower milk production, lower growth potential, lower mature body weight. Yeah, so to me that's just kind of what I have observed over time, and it really does fit with the concepts that you presented.
No, that's an interesting point. And, not only personally, but also that research Cal heard at Valiant, we saw that very thing. We had animals that did very well in a essentially year-round grazing system where they're grazing forage. And then we had animals that didn't perform as well. And the unique thing about that is it didn't matter if those animals were on stockpile Bermuda, which is just meeting a dry cow's requirement, or on lush ryegrass. Some animals just perform better on forage than what others did. So I think that was one of the most interesting things that we started to see in that data. You could sure select over time for animals that stay in better body condition in forage systems. And
yeah, maybe the extreme would be Horiannies or Longhorns, cattle with extremely low requirements, low productivity, but low requirements might thrive more in the intensive systems.
We have a question coming from Brian Frecking. Is there a benefit to monitoring forage species, warm season versus cool season, and also bare soil on these systems as we're analyzing our systems? And when should we take a snapshot in time to monitor those?
Absolutely, there would be benefit to that. And again, that is a big component of adaptive grazing, is that you can't manage what you don't measure. And I would agree with that, even if we don't use the adaptive word. To be responsive to what's happening in the system, we have to measure it. So again, if we look at a warm season grass, the time to do that would be, of course, naturally during the warm season growing conditions. Cool season would be during the cool season growing points of the year when that plant is in vegetative growth. and probably before we turn cows into that paddock. So what we do see is major differences in density of those forage species out there. But yeah, maybe we would want to track how much crabgrass or how much foxtail, maybe a less desirable forage to us, we're seeing in those paddocks. And are the decisions we're making changing that forage diversity over time? So that is all good data to have. And in a true mixed system, which I think maybe is what Brian's asking, if you have fescue and if you have Bermuda, of course, we can use that system to change the timing of defoliation to promote one of those species over the other, much like we would a stockpiling system. So if I want to start promoting fescue, I may leave a little more fescue residue in the spring, which would start to maybe suppress Bermuda a little bit more through the summer, and vice versa. We could manage that opposite as well. I hope that answered the question.
Excellent.
Yeah, and again, I probably should mention with adaptive grazing, it's not just measurements on the forage side. We need to be taking actual measurements on the livestock side as well. What is the performance coming off of that new system, that new change in that system, and was it worth the inputs that we had to change?
Thank you, Brian. We got another question in the Q&A. What are some resources and what would you consider the best ones for designing paddocks in pastures, odd shaped waterways? How do we get this to fit, and what would be the best way for these planning?
I actually had a couple pictures of that originally in this presentation that I present to the students, but it's a very simple square pasture. It's got a big pond in the middle, and we put a 4 paddock right through the pond. Life is so simple. And then the next one was a 900-acre ranch that I worked on, and we ended up with about 30 something different paddocks, about 5 or 6 different forage species. We had to move things around because of water. We couldn't be right here during May because the neighbor's bull would jump the fence with the heifers. There's various things go into these systems. So I will tell you that I don't know of any resource that will tell you exactly where to put your fence. I do think there's advantages into looking at the size and the productivity of the soils themselves and basing actual forage production per paddock, not just acreage per paddock. I would try to split based on soils. Water will always be the hardest thing when it comes to making a multi-paddock rotation system. We have to have water for those cows in every single paddock. So that's usually what dictates how many paddocks we can have, is getting the water there and how much labor are you willing to put in as a manager. I know that doesn't answer the question, but again, that's where our county educators, I would also say, could play a big role, is to help you look at some of our at aerial photos of your operation. We can look at web soil survey, at the soil productivity, and we can start to put these plans together. Normally, that's something I would do with producers, but it takes a while, and it takes me becoming more familiar with each person's individual system to be able to help them with that. I should have just said, contact your local county extension educator, period. That's what I should have said.
It's extremely site specific and takes a lot of local knowledge to. A lot of times the slope and soil types don't show up in a lot of our satellite maps, for sure.
And I do think, again, with the adaptive grazing, that's the thing I'm most optimistic about, is maybe getting producers to realize that they are the subject matter experts in their own grazing system. They know the production capabilities, they know where the bottlenecks are, so to speak, and that they need to start taking and collecting better data to help them make decisions down the road. So I do like that part of the adaptive grazing concept.